Today's episode of Cold Case Frozen Tundra is sponsored by Podcorn. Podcorn is a marketplace that brings together podcasters and brands on an easy-to-navigate, simple-to-use platform, connecting shows of any size with those looking to sponsor host-read ads, interview segments, topical discussions, and more. It's important to us that we choose to collaborate with the brands and products we love, ones we want to share with you. And that's why we at Cold Case Frozen Tundra are Podcorn users ourselves. The Podcorn platform makes it simple to communicate directly with brands listed in their marketplace, learn more about their brand's history, products, and values, and then propose partnerships with easy-to-follow terms that don't ask us to give away any rights to our show. Podcorn even creates a dashboard for each podcast that allows potential partners to quickly see the information they need to know, like the average number of episode downloads, and make choices that best suit their brand and their sponsorship needs. So we know we are partnering with a great brand and product, and they know exactly what they're getting in return. Whether you're a podcaster yourself or a brand interested in sponsoring shows like ours, we highly recommend Podcorn. Click the link in our episode notes or visit the Brands We Love section of our website to sign up for your free Podcorn profile and start browsing opportunities. Hello and welcome to Cold Case Frozen Tundra. I'm Matt Hiskis, your co-host along with Dr. Jordan Karsten, into our investigation to find the missing remains of Starkey Swenson. Today's show will have a different format than earlier episodes. As Dr. Karsten and his team prepare to begin excavation efforts at the site we've identified as a potential location for Starkey's body, we wanted to take a step back to share our thoughts on this case to this point, provide updates on new information we've learned since the podcast began airing, and answer questions submitted from our listeners.
Yeah, that's right. This case spans decades. It involves a number of individuals who are both directly and indirectly involved with the story and relies on personal accounts of the details that don't always line up perfectly. Before we begin our excavation of the site where we hope to find Starkey's remains, and with it some answers in this case, we will release an episode next week sharing details on the science and technology of a search for skeletal remains, interviewing some of the experts who will join us at the site to aid in the investigation. But before that, we wanted to take a moment to reset. This case is complicated, and so we're going to get into that now. And this is Cold Case Frozen Tundra, Episode 6, What We Know Today.
I think a great place to start off today's episode is by sharing some of the new information we've learned since we started our investigation into the disappearance of Starkey Swenson. As the podcast is launched, we've been fortunate to hear from many community members and listeners who have shared details, tips, and theories they know or have heard about this case. One theory we've heard from several individuals is that John Andrews buried Starkey Swenson on the grounds of the airport in Appleton, Wisconsin. Many have specifically cited he's under the new runways constructed during that time period.
Yeah, this theory has apparently been around for quite some time. We've actually mentioned it in previous episodes. It's possible, just like anything else, especially given the ties John Andrews had to the airport and the airline industry as an airplane inspector. We haven't followed up on this theory too much for a couple of reasons. First, the rumor that Starkey was buried at the airport's been circling for long enough that detectives were aware of it during their initial investigation. They looked into it to the extent that they could, but at the end of the day, it would take some very concrete proof to justify an excavation under an operating airstrip. And the Appleton Airport, for people who aren't familiar with it, is an international airport with commercial flights that are operating around the clock. And so that wouldn't necessarily be something easy to accomplish.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really also kind of the second reason we haven't looked into this theory much. Not only does the information we've received from Jean and her family members provide a more likely scenario that might lead to the recovery of Starkey's remains, but we also don't have the ability, really, to do much at the airport. If Starkey truly is buried on that site, which certainly is possible, it might be next to impossible to recover the remains without a significant break in the case that pointed to a specific location at that site.
Yeah, let me add one piece to that. And that is that although there were rumors circulating at the time that that occurred, they're probably just connected to the fact that Andrews worked at the airport. It would be hard to gain access to an area at an airport, a functioning one, near a runway that's being built. It wouldn't be impossible for us to look into this with the use of ground penetrating radar. And potentially we could, but we'd have to have an actual good reason to go there and engage in that kind of analysis.
And have the airport's permission to shut down operations to an airstrip for a while.
For sure, which is not something that is easily done and obviously costs a ton of money.
Right. So a second new piece of information we've learned since we began airing our initial episodes is one that requires a little bit of a mea culpa on our part. It's something we got wrong. We've heard from Christy, who's a teacher at Shattuck Middle School, that the covered walkway in the alcove at that school, it's the one we repeatedly mentioned did not exist at the time through several of our episodes, actually has been around since well before the events occurred there on August 13th, 1983. Before our trip to that site in person, we looked up the site online. Aerial maps made it appear that the walkway didn't exist, even in recent years, but Christy provided us photos which showed the walkway was present at the school as far back as the 1950s, so not accurate on our part.
Yeah, I mean, we got that part wrong, but I'm not sure that this particular detail has much impact on the account of the events that night. The walkway connects the building in front of the school that's closer to the road to the main building behind it. It's the area between the two buildings that creates the alcove space where Suzanne overheard the altercation between John and Starkey. Parked on Elm Street near Division, Suzanne would not have been able to see into the alcove due to the small building closest to the road. I definitely can see how she would have been able to hear what was going on just on the other side of that building in the alcove.
Yeah, I agree. And that's not the only piece of new information we received from Christy and her historical photos. We also learned another detail which, I think, does have more of an impact on our understanding of the events of August 13th.
For sure. So if you remember from our tour of the Shattuck School site, Loudon Boulevard, the spot where Suzanne drives after overhearing the altercation in the courtyard and reports seeing John Andrews leaning into the trunk of his car, has an angle that can see into the alcove. But I mean, it's a long ways away. I mean, just check out our YouTube footage when we visited the site. It really is a long ways away. When you're at that location, there's a full football field with room for a track around it. And then there's a large staff parking lot between you and the alcove.
We tested the account from that night by having Dr. Karsten walk into the alcove while I stood at the corner of Loudon and Elm. As he mentioned, you can find footage of this on our YouTube channel. While there's little doubt that Suzanne could see John's car from that distance, and she definitely could, it's hard to say that she could definitively identify John Andrews' face from that vantage point. Dr. Karsten in the alcove, to me, was just a tiny speck on the horizon from my view as I stood on that corner. There's definitely no way I could see his face, and that was in full daylight. Suzanne was there at night.
The new information Christy provided makes it even more difficult to reconcile this, as she provided photos that show how the school looked before more recent renovations that have been made since the murder and trial. During the 1980s, the staff parking lot between Loudon and the alcove was only half of its current size. Instead, there were several fenced-in tennis courts, which appear in photos to have either banners mounted on the fence or some sort of ivy growing in spots. Either way, the tennis courts would definitely add yet another barrier, making it difficult to see into the alcove from Loudon Boulevard. It's still not impossible, and that's for sure, but it would have been difficult. We'll post the historic photos to our Facebook and Instagram accounts for those who are interested.
Yeah, I agree with you. And that kind of brings us to one of the questions we are most commonly asked. It really is the most common by a long shot. What do we think of the case, the arrest of John Andrews, and the accounts of the case's main witnesses, Suzanne Eggert and Claire Andrews? And I want to first say that these are, of course, our own personal views, but for me, I believe that the witness accounts are, in large part, credible. Suzanne's ability to see John Andrews' face from Loudon Boulevard that night might, understandably, make a difference in a court of law, where there has to be very little room for alternate possibilities. But on a practical level, I do think Suzanne, as John's girlfriend at the time, would probably be able to recognize his voice coming from that alcove. I find her story to be credible, even if individual points have changed over the years as memories fade. I also think that as people tend to look for holes in a story you're recounting, it's only natural to slowly, maybe even subconsciously, start to fill in the gaps in your mind with details that make your story ironclad.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, in my mind, the fact that Suzanne recounts hearing John Andrews and Starkey Swenson in a confrontation over Claire Andrews, which we know John Andrews was upset about. And then the fact that she hears a car revving, hitting something scraping on the concrete, and eventually wood cracking fits perfectly with the very limited, admittedly, physical evidence that was recovered from the scene. And that includes the gouge in the pavement, the gouge in the grass, the broken tree, and some paint that's scraped in there into the pavement itself. And so even though the testing didn't really back up that it was John Andrews' car definitively, to me, that story, along with those, physical aspects at the site, do lend a lot of credence to Suzanne Eggert's account of what happened the night of Starkey Swenson's disappearance and murder, to me. One of the biggest questions that I have, undoubtedly, is if Claire Andrews could have heard what happened that night. As we've brought up in previous episodes, her house is located directly across the street from where the grassy alcove is at Shattuck Junior High School. To me, when you've got two men yelling at each other in a 1970s muscle car, revving up to and hitting somebody, on a hot summer night where there's a good chance you get your windows open, I just have a hard time believing that she wouldn't have heard that altercation. And so to me, I think that raises the biggest questions. Like, how did she not hear this altercation occurring right next to her house? And then on top of that, why would she continue to see John Andrews, socially and sexually after he, is believed to have committed this murder? And she must have been suspicious just based on the fact that Starkey disappeared after that night. And so to me, I mean, those really raise a lot of questions.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that when you reflect back on the timeline of this case, obviously we've condensed it down into a handful of weeks, but there's a 10-year stretch where nobody's really sure at all what happened. But those who are most involved with the case probably have, of course, the best sense of knowing what's going on. So Claire, as an individual who's got more insight than your average citizen into who might be motivated, where Starkey Swenson may have been that night, who else might have been around him, it certainly seems quite plausible that she'd have some doubts, at least, that John was involved. So the fact that she continues in relationship with him of some kind is interesting and definitely does raise questions.